Hello, I'm Josh Cottell. I'm Research Manager at Centre for London, and I'm going to be talking you through some of the findings and recommendations from our recently released report about micromobility in London. So the first question you might have about micromobility is, what is it? It's a name that we've come to use to categorize a group of different vehicles which are distinct but have some similarities. They're small vehicles which are powered by electric motors or by pedaling or by both of these in combination that can be safely ridden alongside conventional bicycles in cycle lanes. In our report, we focus on the three most common of these in London at the moment, and those are conventional pedal bicycles, and then the newer e-bikes and e-scooters, where E is for electric. You'll have seen electric scooters around London. They can be legally used at the moment as part of ongoing trials, which are going on in about 50 different areas across the UK. These trials are temporary, and we've been investigating to what extent e-scooters, e-bikes, and other conventional bikes could form a bigger part of transport infrastructure in the city. This slide gives you an idea of how common micromobility use is in London. At the moment, if we focus on the left part of this graph, we can see the proportion of different journeys made in London and see that that blue bar, about a third of trips made in London are by car at present. This data is from 2019. Then about a quarter are made by walking, and the next three bars are a combination of public transport. So about another third of trips are made by public transport. And that green bar at the top, that 2%, that's the proportion of trips made by cycling. Now, if we look at Amsterdam on the right, the green bar there shows that more than 10 times the proportion of trips made in Amsterdam are by cycling, 27%. And although they've got more driving and less walking and public transport there, it gives an idea of how transport in London could change given the right circumstances. Indeed, there have been changes already to how people get around London since the year 2000. So over the last couple of decades, we've seen the amount of people using public transport increase and the number of people using private transport, so for instance, driving a car, decrease. And the proportion of people using cycling to get around has doubled, and albeit from 1% to 2%, but still it has doubled. And there are other ways that travel in London could change going into the future. If e-scooters were to stick around, if their trials were to be made into permanently available shared schemes, and if their use was legalized, we might see people moving from driving private cars to using e-scooters. Studies vary, but a recent study from Paris suggests that about 1 in 10 people who ride an e-scooter, when asked what they would do if that e-scooter wasn't available, say that they would have driven a car. Now, most of the other people said that they would have maybe ridden a bike or walked or taken public transport, but that 1 in 10 suggests that we can get some people from driving private cars into using these more sustainable modes of transport. In London, 2 in 3 car trips could be cycled in 20 minutes or less, and most of these are in outer London, where people are currently less likely to cycle than in inner London. And at the same time, these different forms of transport, so cycling or riding an e-bike or e-scooter, are very compatible with public transport. Say you wanted to make a trip, but your closest train station is too long of a walk away. If you had a really good cycle lane in between and an affordable bike available, or an e-scooter or other vehicle, then perhaps you'd be tempted, if it was affordable, to use micromobility in conjunction with a train to get into the city centre rather than driving it. And this kind of gets into what determines whether or not people use micromobility. If doing so has all of these benefits, why aren't people at the moment? And we think there's a number of reasons that people might be unable at the moment to use micromobility, and we call these barriers to using it. And I'll go into those in just a moment. But firstly, I'm just going to talk about one of the key benefits that use of micromobility could bring about, and one of the things that's talked about as one of the key risks of more people riding around on e-scooters and bikes, before going into the barriers, and then what we recommend should be done to enable more people to use these different modes safely. So this graph shows the CO2 emissions of different kinds of transport. What we can see at the top is that for the same number of people traveling over the same distance, taxis are one of the most environmentally unfriendly ways of getting around, followed by ride sourcing and using a private car with an internal combustion engine. Then all the different kinds of micromobility here, from shared e-scooters and shared bikes and e-bikes down to privately owned versions of these, are much more environmentally friendly in terms of the amounts of CO2 that they emit. So if people were to switch from driving a private car to using these different types of transport, we might see lower CO2 emissions, which would be really key given that the Mayor Sadiq Khan has committed to London reaching net zero CO2 emissions by 2030. We might need to see, for that to be the case, quite big changes to how we travel around the city, and micromobility could be a big part of that. Now, one of the key risks that's talked about when it comes to micromobility is the risk of injury to road users and to riders themselves by using these vehicles. This graph shows data from London, showing the risk of fatal or serious injury to another road user by a vehicle, by different vehicle types. So what we can see immediately here is that motorcycles on the left pose the highest risk of fatal or serious injuries to other road users. This is followed by taxis, cars, goods vehicles, and then bicycles and buses or coaches. And what we can see from this is that conventional bicycles, at least, tend to pose a much lower risk to other road users than various other kinds of public transport. And we saw earlier that a third of trips in London are made by private car. Bicycles pose less of a threat to private cars. And emerging evidence from studies about e-scooters and e-bikes suggests that the risk that they pose to other road users and to riders themselves tends to be broadly similar to that posed by bicycles. And although it's early days and we need to see more studies coming out, it's reassuring that this suggests that e-scooters, e-bikes, and bikes are all broadly relatively safe modes of travel. But at the moment, not everyone uses micromobility. As we saw, only 2% of people, or 2% of journeys, in London are cycled. And we know from data in London that cyclists don't represent the city's population. They tend to be younger, more likely to be male, employed and affluent, and even white. And international evidence suggests that users of shared micromobility generally tend to be young and male compared to local populations. Early evidence about e-bikes and e-scooters suggests they might appeal to a slightly different set of riders. So for instance, with electric bikes, they might appeal to riders of a more representative set of age categories, perhaps because they make it easier to travel the same amount of distance. And this presents the opportunity perhaps to expand access to micromobility if these different newer modes appeal to different groups. And so that's part of the reason why we think they present an important opportunity to changing how people travel in London. So why don't people currently use micromobility? Well, for some people, it's going to be a choice. It's not for them. But for others, maybe there are barriers in the way. One of those barriers might be geography. So what we can see here is a map of London with on-street cycle parking bays presented by dots. And the darker the dots, the more parking bays there are. And what we can take from this is that on-street cycle parking in London is overwhelmingly concentrated in the centre of the city. And although there are parking bays elsewhere, there are large parts of outer London where there are no bays whatsoever. And so that means that for someone living in outer London, if they wanted to cycle or ride an e-bike or e-scooter to where they were going, there might not be any parking when they get there, which is a real barrier to using those modes of transport. We also know that this kind of thing holds true for many other kinds of infrastructure. And so people in outer London or people in less densely parts of the city may not face the same opportunities to use micromobility as those in the centre. There are a range of other barriers which aren't just based on geography, as well as the inconsistent access to shared schemes, which tend to be in inner London. There are requirements for how you hire a vehicle. You might need to have a smartphone or be proficient in using English. There is the high cost of buying a bike or an e-bike or an e-scooter, which is a real barrier to many Londoners. Further, there's a lack of safe segregated cycle lanes in many parts of London, as well as parking, as we just saw, and the difficulty of encumbered journeys, so journeys with your shopping or with your children doing the school run perhaps, which would be made much easier with a cargo bike, but they are really expensive. Then there are perceptions that cycling is unsafe and perhaps that it's just not for me. And for some people that's going to be true, but for others, perhaps if we were able to make cycling safer and present it in a way that is not just based on those who currently use it, which, as we saw, tend to be young, more likely to be male, then more people might feel that cycling or riding one of these other modes is for them. And we want to, I think, ensure that everyone is able to make a genuine choice about whether or not to use them. So how do we get to a position where people can make this genuine choice? We've made a set of recommendations under a number of headings which seek to do just this. So they seek to provide a consistent approach across London and the UK, which would enable people who live in different parts of London to have similar experiences. Then we want to enable sustainable and active travel. As we saw, riding these types of micromobility is more sustainable and more active than getting in a privately owned car. And so we want to enable people to choose to do that. We want the city to provide enough space to ride and park micromobility vehicles and to do so in a way that's convenient, that's safe and even fun. And we want to ensure that micromobility is safe, not only for riders, but for pedestrians too. And investing in that high quality infrastructure alongside a number of other measures could help us to achieve this. For instance, operators of shared schemes using penalties and rewards to encourage safe ridership and to discourage people, for instance, rushing through traffic. And finally, we want to make micromobility accessible to all Londoners, not just those in the centre and not just those who are currently likely to use it. We've set out specific recommendations in our report, which you can look at the link posted below. But for now, I think that's it from me. Thank you for listening.